My boyfriend accused me of cheating in public while I was pregnant, saying the baby wasn't his, and that I wouldn't even know who the father was. I met him at Claire's birthday party 3 years ago. One of those casual backyard gatherings where everyone knows someone who knows someone else. And by the end of the night, you've exchanged numbers with a stranger who made you laugh at the right moment. He worked in sales at a pharmaceutical company, had an easy smile, and didn't try too hard to impress me. That last part mattered more than I realized at the time. We talked for hours that night, standing by the drink table while the party moved around us. He told me about his job, the challenges of meeting quotas and dealing with difficult doctors. I told him about my work at the insurance company, the endless paperwork and occasional client meltdown. Normal stuff, regular people stuff. Our first date was coffee on a Saturday afternoon, which turned into dinner, which turned into walking around downtown until the streetlights came on. He was attentive without being clingy, funny without trying too hard. And when he kissed me goodnight, it felt natural, easy, like we'd been doing this for years instead of hours. We fell into a rhythm quickly after that. Dinners on weeknights when we both got out of work at reasonable times, weekend trips to the farmer's market, movie nights where we'd argue good-naturedly about whether the ending was satisfying or a cop-out. It felt healthy, stable, the kind of relationship where you can be yourself without performing. We dated for 1.5 years before deciding to move in together. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood where the rent was $1,200 a month split down the middle. I worked as an administrative coordinator at an insurance company. He had his steady job, and we both thought we were being smart and practical about our future. The kind of future people talk about in whispers at first, testing the waters. Marriage came up in conversations over takeout dinners. Kids were a maybe someday topic that felt distant and abstract. We'd lie in bed on Sunday mornings and talk about what our lives might look like in 5 years. 10 years. A house, maybe. A dog. Possibly children if the timing worked out. All theoretical, all comfortable in its distance from reality. Meeting his family happened 4 months into our relationship. His mother opened the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And I remember thinking it was just nervousness. First impressions and all that. But the coldness never really thawed. She'd ask questions that felt like interrogations disguised as small talk. Where was I from originally? What did my parents do for work? How many serious relationships had I been in before her son? What were my plans for the next 5 years? Each question felt weighted, like she was checking boxes on some invisible list I couldn't see. His father was quieter, almost apologetic in the way he'd steer conversations away from uncomfortable territories. He'd interrupt with offers of more coffee or suggestions to look at the garden, anything to break the tension his wife created. His sister seemed to take cues from their mother, watching me with the same evaluative stare, occasionally jumping in with her own probing questions about my education, my career trajectory, my family's financial situation. I tried to win them over at first, brought homemade desserts to family dinners, complimented his mother's cooking, asked interested questions about family history and traditions. None of it worked. If anything, my efforts seemed to make her more suspicious, like kindness itself was evidence of manipulation. His father would sometimes pull me aside and apologize for his wife's coldness, saying she was protective of their son, that she'd warm up eventually. I wanted to believe him. Spent months believing him, actually, thinking I just needed to be patient and consistent, and eventually she'd see I wasn't a threat. I got pregnant 6 months after we moved in together. We were careful, I was on birth control, and it still happened. One of those statistics you never think will apply to you until it does. I'd been feeling off for a week, nauseous in the mornings, exhausted by mid-afternoon, crying at commercials that weren't even particularly sad. Took 3 pregnancy tests before I believed what I was seeing. 2 pink lines, 3 different brands, all the same result. When I told him, sitting on the edge of our bed with the test still in my hand, he went pale for about 10 seconds before pulling me into a hug that felt more like he was steadying himself than comforting me. Then the shock morphed into something that looked like excitement. He started talking immediately about turning the 2nd bedroom into a nursery, about baby names, about how his parents would react. That last part should have been a warning, but I was too overwhelmed to notice. He called his parents that same night, and I heard his mother's voice through the phone, sharp and probing even in congratulations. She wanted to know how far along I was, whether we'd been trying, whether I was sure about the dates. He answered her questions without questioning why she was asking them. The questions started around month 3 of the pregnancy. Little things at first. Why was I 10 minutes late coming home from work? Who was I texting when I smiled at my phone? Did I really need to go to that work happy hour? I chalked it up to nerves about becoming a father, about our lives changing in ways we couldn't fully control yet. So I offered him my phone password, showed him my texts, my call log, my emails, then my email password. Then I turned on location sharing so he could see exactly where I was at any given moment. I thought transparency would ease his mind. Instead, it seemed to give him permission to dig deeper, to question more, to demand explanations for things that needed no explanation. By month 4, the questions had escalated into full interrogations. I'd walk in the door after work and he'd already be looking at my location history, asking why I'd stopped at a particular intersection for 7 minutes. Traffic light, I'd say. He'd ask if I was sure, if I'd maybe pulled over to meet someone, to make a phone call I didn't want him to hear. I'd show him my call log to prove I hadn't called anyone. He'd say I could have deleted calls, could have used a different app. By month 5, I was getting texts every hour asking what I was doing, even when he could literally see my location was at my office desk. He'd check my location, and if I was somewhere unexpected, even just a different grocery store because they had better produce that week, I'd come home to an interrogation. Why that store? Who did I see there? Did anyone talk to me? Why didn't I mention beforehand that I was going there instead of the usual place? The questions felt like traps, carefully constructed so that any answer I gave could be twisted into evidence of something suspicious. I started rehearsing my responses before walking through the door, practicing innocent explanations for perfectly innocent activities. The anxiety crept into everything. I'd declined a work dinner because the thought of explaining it to him felt exhausting. Stopped responding to texts from male coworkers entirely, even work-related ones because I didn't want to deal with the aftermath. Started documenting my entire day in my head so I could recite it back to him without contradictions. I told myself it was temporary. First-time father anxiety. Hormones doing strange things to both of us. All those explanations people give when they don't want to admit something is deeply wrong, when acknowledging the truth means having to make decisions you're not ready to make. Then came the night everything cracked open. We were both in bed, around 11:30 on a Wednesday. He'd fallen asleep with his phone unlocked next to him, which was unusual because he'd become obsessive about his phone privacy. Always face down, always locked, always dismissive when I asked who was texting. I wasn't snooping, not really. I reached over to move it to his nightstand so it wouldn't fall between the bed and the wall, and saw a notification from a group chat. Just a preview of text that said something about the situation and what we talked about. My stomach dropped before my brain fully processed why. Something in the phrasing, in the secretive tone, told me I needed to see more. I opened the messages. There were 8 men in that group chat. His closest friends, guys I'd met at barbecues and game nights, men who'd shaken my hand and smiled at me while their girlfriends made small talk about baby registry items. The conversation was weeks deep, dating back to early in my pregnancy, and it was all about me. About whether I'd cheated. About whether the baby was really his. About how women these days couldn't be trusted. They'd created a poll, an actual online poll with my name at the top, speculating about who I might have slept with. They'd listed 3 of my male coworkers by name, guys I'd mentioned in passing when talking about my workday. Added percentages to each name like they were betting odds. Made jokes about DNA tests and dodging bullets and getting trapped. His brother was in the chat, actively participating, making jokes about paternity tests and commenting on the poll results like it was some kind of game. Writing things like, "My money's on the guy from accounting," and "She's definitely the type." The type of what? I wanted to scream. The type who'd been faithful and supportive and patient with increasingly paranoid behavior? That type? I scrolled back through weeks of messages. They'd been discussing me since month 2 of my pregnancy, analyzing my social media posts for clues, debating whether my pregnancy glow was suspicious, sharing screenshots of my interactions with male coworkers from company events. One of them had apparently followed me on a work happy hour just to see if I talked to anyone male, then reported back to the group that I'd laughed at something a coworker said. That was evidence, apparently. Laughter was proof of infidelity in their twisted logic. I took screenshots of everything. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone twice, but I captured every message, every vote in their disgusting poll, every joke at my expense, every accusation masquerading as concern, dozens of screenshots. Then I woke him up, just reached over and shook his shoulder until he opened his eyes, confused and half asleep, probably wondering why I looked so pale in the glow of the phone screen. I held it in front of his face and watched recognition dawn. The look on his face told me everything. Not surprise that I'd found it. Not shame at what he'd done. Just annoyance that he'd been caught. What? He sat up, rubbing his eyes. Baby, it's just guy talk. Just guy talk? I held the phone closer to his face. There's a poll with my name on it, about who I slept with. You went through my phone? You created a betting pool. You listed my coworkers by name, Mark, David, Steven from accounting. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Men talk like this with their friends. You're overreacting. Show me one piece of evidence. My voice was shaking now. One text message, one photo, one witness account. One thing that made you think I cheated. He couldn't. Just stared at the screen, then at me, his face shifting from defensive to cornered. I just had a feeling. Things didn't add up. What things? You smiled at your phone. You were late from work. I smile when I get funny texts from my mother. I was late because of traffic. Those are normal things. You're gaslighting me, he said, his voice rising, making me feel crazy for having reasonable concerns. Reasonable. I scrolled through the screenshots I'd taken. Your brother voted in this poll. Your friends joked about DNA tests for weeks. And you never once asked me directly if something was wrong. You just let them tear me apart. We fought until 4 a.m, him defending his right to his feelings, me demanding to know what feelings justified public humiliation and cruel speculation about my character. He said I was making it about me when it was about his anxiety, his fears about becoming a father, his need for support from his friends. I said his anxiety was manifesting as emotional abuse, and he laughed at the word abuse like I'd accused him of something absurd. Asked how it could be abuse when he'd never hit me, never even raised his voice before tonight, as if abuse required bruises to be real. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted, and he'd fallen back asleep like nothing had happened. I lay there staring at the ceiling, one hand on my stomach where our daughter was growing, and made the decision to call a lawyer. The lawyer I met with 3 days later specialized in family law. I'd found her through a referral from a coworker who'd been through a nasty divorce. She was in her 50s, had kind eyes behind practical glasses, and didn't judge me when I ugly cried through half the consultation. Her office was small but organized, a box of tissues on every surface. I showed her everything. The screenshots of the group chat, the poll with my name at the top, the text messages from him alternating between apology and accusation, the timeline of his escalating questions. Laid it all out on her desk like evidence at a trial. She took notes methodically, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and times and witnesses. When I finished, she looked at me directly and said 3 words that changed everything. Document absolutely everything. She explained that family court wasn't about who was right or wrong, but about who could prove their case. Every conversation going forward should be in writing when possible. Text messages, not phone calls. Emails, not face-to-face discussions. If he made accusations, I should respond calmly and ask for specific evidence. If he couldn't provide it, that became part of the record. She told me to keep a journal with dates, times, and details of every interaction, to save every message, every social media post, every piece of evidence of harassment or defamation. She said it might not feel like it now, but I was building a case for custody, for protection, for my future. That word, custody, made it all feel horribly real. Made me realize I was preparing for a war I'd never wanted to fight, planning for a future where my daughter's father was someone I needed legal protection from. The retainer fee was $1,500, which felt like a fortune on my salary, but I paid it anyway. Signed papers that outlined legal strategy and fee structures and confidentiality agreements. Left her office with a folder full of instructions and a sick feeling in my stomach that this was really happening, that I was really preparing to legally separate myself from the father of my child before she was even born. The next few weeks were tense in a way that made the apartment feel smaller, like the walls were closing in. He'd apologize, then justify, then apologize again in a cycle that went nowhere. Said he was sorry for how it looked, but not for having doubts. Sorry for involving his friends, but not for discussing his concerns. Sorry I was hurt, but not for the actions that hurt me. Non-apologies that made everything worse because they showed me exactly how he viewed the situation. I stopped engaging. Stopped trying to defend myself or explain or convince him. Just went to work, came home, made dinner, went to bed, responded to his messages with simple acknowledgments. Okay. Noted. Thank you for telling me. He seemed to think I'd eventually forgive him if he was patient enough. Like this was a rough patch we'd weather and come out stronger. Like public humiliation and violation of trust were relationship hurdles instead of relationship enders. I let him think that because I wasn't ready for the next explosion yet. I knew it was coming, though. I could feel it building like pressure before a storm. His parents hosted an annual summer party at their house every year. Big event, 50 or 60 people, backyard full of relatives and family friends and neighbors from their gated community. They'd been doing it for over 20 years, one of those traditions that defined their social calendar. I was 7 months pregnant by then, obviously showing uncomfortable in the heat, and I didn't want to go. Told him I wasn't feeling well, that my back hurt, that standing for hours sounded miserable. But he insisted it would look bad if I didn't show up, that people would talk, that his mother was already upset enough without me giving her more ammunition. That last part should have been a bigger warning than it was. I was still trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for reasons I can't fully explain now. Some combination of denial and hope and fear of making things worse than they already were. So I went. Wore a loose dress that accommodated my belly, comfortable shoes because my feet were swelling, and smiled politely at people who asked when I was due. His mother barely acknowledged my arrival, just gave me a tight smile and turned immediately to greet someone else. His sister offered me a drink with a tone that suggested she hoped I'd refuse, like she was setting some kind of trap. His father was the only one who seemed genuinely pleased to see me, asked how I was feeling, insisted I sit down in the shade, and brought me water without being asked. The party was in full swing by early afternoon. Burgers on the grill, kids running through sprinklers, adults clustering in groups with drinks in hand. I tried to stay on the periphery, sitting in a lawn chair his father had dragged over for me, making small talk with the few people who approached me. Mostly older relatives who didn't seem to be in on whatever was happening, who just saw a pregnant young woman and wanted to share advice or horror stories from their own pregnancies. Around 3 o'clock, I noticed his friends arriving, the ones from the group chat. They clustered together near the deck, occasionally glancing in my direction and saying things that made each other laugh. My stomach started to hurt in a way that had nothing to do with pregnancy. Something was coming. The announcement came at 3:15, right when the party was at its peak attendance. He climbed up onto the deck steps so everyone could see him. I thought he was going to do some kind of toast. People quieted down, turned to face him, smiling like they were expecting something pleasant. "I have an announcement to make." His voice carried across the yard. The yard went completely silent. Even the kids stopped playing. "After the baby is born, I'll be getting a paternity test." Someone gasped. I watched people's faces shift from confused to shocked to something that looked like vindication on some faces. "I'm not going to be trapped," he continued louder now. "I know what women are capable of these days. I'm not going to be another fool who believed everything he was told." He gestured directly toward me, making sure every single person at that party knew exactly who he was talking about. Every single person turned to stare. 60 pairs of eyes on me at once, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what was happening fast enough to react or defend myself or even stand up and leave. His mother stood up immediately from where she'd been sitting in a lawn chair near the grill. Actually stood and applauded before anyone else, and that seemed to give everyone permission to react. She hugged him, right there in front of everyone. Told him she was so proud of him for being smart, for not letting himself get trapped the way his father had been. That last part felt like she'd been saving it, rehearsing it, waiting for exactly this moment to say it. Several people actually clapped. Mostly his friends, but also some of the older relatives who seemed to think this was some kind of brave declaration instead of public humiliation. I could hear them muttering to each other, saying things like, "Good for him," and "About time someone had the courage," and "You can't be too careful these days." His sister had her phone out before he'd even finished speaking, recording the whole thing from multiple angles like she was documenting history. She kept saying she was going to put it in the family group chat, tag me in it, make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. His brother was laughing, actually laughing, slapping him on the back like he'd just won some kind of victory. The friends from the group chat were cheering, raising their beers, and their girlfriends were smiling these tight, superior smiles like they'd known all along. I was exactly what he was claiming I was. I sat there with my hands on my stomach, feeling our daughter move inside me, and couldn't make my body work properly. Couldn't stand up, couldn't speak, couldn't even cry. Just sat there while people stared and whispered and judged, while my 7-month pregnant body became evidence of some crime I hadn't committed, while the man I'd thought I'd build a life with destroyed me in front of everyone who mattered to him. I tried to leave, finally managed to get my body moving, pushed myself up out of the lawn chair with effort because everything felt heavy and wrong, headed for the side gate that led to the driveway where I'd parked, thinking if I could just get to my car, I could fall apart in private. But 3 of his friends cornered me in the kitchen before I could make it outside. Must have seen me heading for the exit and decided to cut me off. They blocked the doorway. These 3 guys I'd laughed with at game nights, who'd made small talk with me about work and weather and normal things. Now they were standing too close, using their size to intimidate, and I was 7 months pregnant with nowhere to go. They started in on me immediately. How dare I do this to him? What kind of person traps a man with a baby? They'd always known I was that type, they said. Had told him months ago to be careful. One of them brought up the co-worker from the poll, asked me point blank if I'd slept with him. When I said no, he laughed and said that's exactly what a cheater would say. Another one got right in my face and told me I was ruining a good man's life, that I should be ashamed of myself for putting him through this. The third one was filming it all on his phone, saying he wanted to catch me in a lie. That body language never lied even when words did. I tried to push past them and one of them grabbed my arm. Not hard enough to leave a bruise, but hard enough to stop me, to make it clear I wasn't leaving until they decided I could leave. Asked me where I thought I was going, if I was running away because I couldn't handle being confronted with the truth. I yanked my arm back and something in my voice that I didn't recognize said, if they touched me again, I'd call the police. That made them laugh. One of them said, go ahead, said the police would probably agree with them once they heard what kind of person I was. Their girlfriends were in the next room, in the dining area just on the other side of the doorway where they could see and hear everything. And they were laughing. Not uncomfortable, nervous laughter, but genuine amusement at my situation, making comments to each other about karma and what goes around. One of them, a woman I'd had dinner with twice, said loudly enough for me to hear that she'd told her boyfriend months ago that I had wandering eyes. Another one said something about how you can always tell which girls are going to cause problems. They were enjoying this, taking pleasure in watching me be cornered and accused and humiliated. I don't remember exactly how I got out. I think his father appeared and said something to them about leaving me alone, about this not being appropriate. They stepped aside reluctantly, still making comments as I passed. I kept my head down and walked as fast as my pregnant body would let me, got to my car and locked the doors immediately. Sat there shaking in the driver's seat for several minutes before I could even put the key in the ignition. Drove to my parents' house in some kind of shock fugue state, where I could see the road and follow traffic rules but couldn't really process what had just happened, couldn't integrate it into any worldview that made sense. I spent the night in my childhood bedroom, staring at walls covered in posters I'd put up in high school, band posters and movie quotes and photos from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else now. My mom brought me tea I didn't drink, sat on the edge of my bed for a while without saying anything, just being there. Checked on me every hour without pushing me to talk. My dad offered multiple times to go over there and confront him, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. I begged him not to, said it would only make things worse, that I needed time to think and process and figure out what the hell I was going to do. That wasn't entirely true. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. I didn't sleep, just lay there replaying the whole scene over and over, trying to understand how someone I'd loved could do that to me. How an entire group of people could participate in my destruction like it was entertainment. Like my humiliation was a spectator sport they'd all bought tickets to. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of messages on my phone. Some from him, alternating between apology and justification in that pattern I'd come to know so well. He was sorry I was hurt, but I had to understand his position. Sorry it happened publicly, but I should have expected consequences for making him doubt. Sorry his friends got involved, but that's what friends do when someone they care about is struggling. On and on, each message somehow managing to apologize while also blaming me for his actions. Some from his sister's social media posts that mutual friends were tagging me in, screenshots people were sending me with messages like, "Have you seen this?" and "What's going on?" Vague posts about trust and deception and modern women who use babies to trap men. Posts with just enough detail that anyone who knew us would know exactly who she was talking about, but vague enough that she could deny it was about me if called out. I took screenshots of all of it, added it to the growing folder on my phone labeled Evidence. Then I checked on my car, which I'd left parked on the street near my parents' house, and found it vandalized. Someone had keyed words into the paint. Ugly words. The kind you'd have to buff out completely to remove. Across the driver's side door in jagged letters, "Cheater." On the hood, "Liar." On the trunk, "Trapped him." My dad came out when he heard me crying and immediately called the police. We filed a report while I sat in my parents' living room with ice cream I couldn't taste, answered questions from an officer who seemed sympathetic, but also clearly thought this was a domestic situation that probably didn't warrant much investigation. He took photos, gave me a case number, said to call if there were any further incidents. I added the police report number to my evidence folder and texted it to my lawyer. A coworker pulled me aside on Monday morning and quietly told me that rumors about my personal life had reached HR. Someone had been calling the office asking questions about me, about my work habits, about whether I spent a lot of time talking to male coworkers, about whether I'd been taking unexplained absences. She didn't know who was calling, just that HR had received multiple calls over the past week. They were starting to wonder if it was harassment, but they needed me to come forward if I wanted them to take action. I thanked her and immediately went to HR myself, explained the situation in the most professional terms I could manage while being 7 months pregnant and on the verge of tears, provided them with the police report number for the vandalism, explained about the public accusations at the party, showed them some of the social media posts his sister had made. I wanted it on record that I was being harassed, that none of this was my doing, that I was the victim here, not the perpetrator. The HR representative was sympathetic, said they'd make notes in my file and would shut down any calls asking about me going forward, but there wasn't much else they could do unless the harassment escalated further. The second meeting with the lawyer was different from the first. I wasn't crying anymore. I was angry. Showed her everything new. The recordings of the party that his sister had posted and then deleted but that I'd saved, the vandalism photos and police report, the evidence of someone calling my workplace to try to damage my reputation, the ongoing stream of social media insinuations. Laid it all out methodically, organized by date and type. The lawyer explained my options in detail this time. Defamation lawsuit based on the public accusations and provably false statements. Restraining order based on the harassment and vandalism. Preparing for what would likely be a contentious custody battle once the baby was born. Each option came with costs and timelines and potential outcomes. I told her I wanted to fight back. Not just defend myself and wait for things to blow over, but actively fight back against every person who'd participated in destroying my reputation. She seemed pleased by that. Said offensive legal strategy was her specialty and she'd represent me well. She gave me homework. Compile a list of everyone who'd been at the party. Everyone who'd participated in the group chat. Everyone who'd made posts or comments. We'd be sending formal cease and desist letters to start, then escalating from there if necessary. I sent him one message after that meeting. Simple and clear, carefully worded with my lawyer's input. He had 1 week to issue a public retraction of his accusations, equivalent in scope to the humiliation he'd caused me at that party, or I'd be filing a lawsuit for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. 1 week. The message was deliberately formal, deliberately cold, deliberately final in tone. He called me immediately, 15 times in a row until I blocked his number. Then he started texting from different numbers. Said I was being dramatic, said I couldn't sue him for having doubts, said his mother had a lawyer too and they'd fight me if I tried. I didn't respond to any of it, just screenshot everything and sent it to my lawyer. She sent him a formal letter the next day outlining exactly what we could sue him for, with legal precedents and case numbers. That shut him up for about 48 hours. 2 days before the scheduled meeting, his mother's lawyer contacted mine. They were threatening a countersuit for harassment and defamation, claimed I'd coerced his father's testimony, that I'd fabricated evidence, that I was the one who'd vandalized my own car for sympathy. My lawyer called me at work to explain. We could proceed, but his mother had hired an expensive firm known for aggressive tactics. This would get uglier before it got better. They'd drag it out, try to bury me in legal fees and depositions and motions. So what do we do? I asked, my hand instinctively going to my stomach. I was 8 months pregnant, exhausted, and terrified. We can still proceed with the meeting, but you need to know what you're walking into. I didn't hesitate. Do it anyway. You're sure? This could take months, cost thousands. They'll fight every step. I'm sure. My voice was steadier than I felt. They humiliated me in front of 60 people. I'm not backing down now. While waiting for his response or non-response, I started asking around, quietly, through mutual friends and acquaintances, about his family, about his parents' marriage, about why his mother seemed so paranoid about women and so obsessively protective of her son in ways that seemed to go beyond normal maternal concern. I got bits and pieces at first. Whispers about his mother being controlling, about fights she'd caused at family gatherings when he brought previous girlfriends around, comments about his father being checked out of the marriage, about how he spent most of his time at work or in his workshop to avoid being in the house. One person mentioned offhand that there'd been some drama around the wedding, something about timing and family pressure, but they didn't know the details. Then I got a direct message from someone I barely knew, a distant relative of his father's who I'd met maybe twice. He said he'd heard through the family grapevine that I was asking questions and he had information I might want. Information about the real story of his parents' marriage. We met at a coffee shop across town on a Wednesday afternoon, one of those generic chain places where nobody looks twice at strangers having intense conversations in corner booths. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table in the back with 2 coffees he'd ordered preemptively. He was in his mid-60s, retired from some kind of engineering job, with tired eyes and the kind of posture that suggested he'd been carrying weight for a very long time. Clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to tell me, shifting in his seat, not making eye contact at first. He confirmed he was the father of the man I'd been living with, though he said it in a way that sounded more like an admission of guilt than a statement of fact, like he was confessing to a crime instead of claiming a relationship. Then he took a long breath and told me everything. His wife had gotten pregnant on purpose 32 years ago. They'd been dating casually for about 4 months, nothing serious. No talk of future or commitment or even exclusivity, really. Just 2 people in their late 20s seeing each other when it was convenient. Then she suddenly announced she was pregnant and everything changed overnight. He'd married her because that's what you did back then. What his own parents expected. What everyone in his social circle would have judged him for not doing. This was before people routinely had babies outside of marriage without scandal, before single parenthood was normalized. He'd proposed because the alternative was being seen as the kind of man who abandoned a pregnant woman, and that wasn't who he wanted to be. The wedding was small and rushed. His parents confused but supportive. Her parents visibly relieved. He found out months after the wedding that she'd stopped taking her birth control without telling him, admitted it during a fight about something else entirely, and then told him it didn't matter because they were married now anyway. Said she'd wanted security, wanted a family, wanted him, and this was how women sometimes had to make things happen in the real world. He stayed. Spent 3 decades in a marriage he'd never wanted because leaving felt impossible. Too much shame, too much social pressure, too much fear of being seen as the kind of man who abandons his family. Too much concern about what divorce would do to his son, about how it would look at work, about what his own parents would think. His wife had been paranoid about other women from the start, he said, even before the wedding, even when he'd never given her reason to doubt. Accused him of affairs he never had with coworkers, with neighbors, with women he'd known before he ever met her. Monitored his friendships obsessively. Made scenes at work events if he talked too long to a female colleague. Called him at the office multiple times a day to verify he was actually there. Went through his wallet and pockets and briefcase looking for evidence of betrayal that didn't exist. And she'd raised their son with those same fears, those same suspicions. Taught him from childhood that women were manipulators who used their bodies and emotions to trap men, that you couldn't trust them fully, that love was always transactional, that pregnancy was a weapon women used to destroy men's freedom. He'd heard her say these things to their son starting when the boy was maybe 10 or 11 years old. Warnings disguised as wisdom, paranoia disguised as protection. I asked if he had proof of any of this. He pulled out his phone and showed me the birth certificate and marriage certificate photos he'd saved years ago. The dates were clear. His son was born 6 months after the wedding, not 9. Anyone who did the math would know the pregnancy came first. I asked why he'd never told his son the truth. He said he'd been protecting the boy from knowing his mother had trapped his father. But now he was tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of watching his son repeat the same paranoid patterns. Tired of being complicit in his wife's narrative. He agreed to testify if it came to that. Said he'd even sign a statement. But his hands were shaking when he said it, and I could see the cost of breaking 30 years of silence written on his face. I need a couple days to think about it, he said quietly, to prepare myself for what this means. But I'm tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of watching my son repeat the same paranoid patterns. Tired of being complicit in her narrative. All he asked was that I give his son a chance to process it first, to understand the full scope of what he'd been taught to believe. I promised nothing except that I'd use the information strategically. Then I went home and added it all to my case file. I had everything I needed now, not just to defend myself, but to dismantle the entire story his mother had built. I called for a formal meeting through my lawyer. Neutral location, professional setting, my lawyer present to keep things legal and documented, and I insisted he bring his mother if he wanted to have any chance of resolving this without going to court. Made it clear through the lawyer that this was his final opportunity to fix what he'd broken, to take responsibility before I took every legal action available to me. He agreed, probably thinking it would be his chance to have his mother back him up, to present some kind of united front, to prove to me and my lawyer that his suspicions were justified by family wisdom and maternal instinct. He had absolutely no idea what was coming. Had no idea I'd spent the past 2 weeks gathering evidence that would blow apart not just his accusations against me, but the entire foundation his mother had built her life on. The meeting happened in a conference room at my lawyer's office. Clean white walls, long table, uncomfortable chairs that forced you to sit up straight. I brought my mother for emotional support, someone to sit next to me and remind me I wasn't alone in this. He showed up 15 minutes early, looking defensive and uncomfortable in khakis and a button-down shirt like he'd dressed for a job interview. Kept checking his phone, presumably texting his mother about where she was, why she was late, whether she was still coming. His mother arrived 25 minutes late, bristling with hostility from the moment she walked in, didn't apologize for being late, didn't greet anyone, just sat down heavily next to her son and stared at me with undisguised contempt. My lawyer started with the formalities, explaining that this was a final attempt at resolution before filing suit, that everything said would be documented, that we were here in good faith to try to avoid court if possible. Then she turned it over to me. I took my time, pulled the documents out of my folder slowly, making sure he could see there was more there than he'd expected. Put the first one on the table, his birth certificate. Original document, certified copy I'd obtained through public records with his father's help. Let him look at it for a moment, seeing the date highlighted in yellow. Then I put down the second document, his parents' marriage certificate, also highlighted. Let him do the math himself. 6 months. His birthday was 6 months after his parents' wedding date. Not 9 months, not 8 months, 6 months, which meant his mother had been 3 months pregnant on her wedding day. I watched his face as he processed what he was seeing, confusion morphing slowly into understanding and then into something that looked like betrayal. He looked at his mother, actually turned away from the documents to stare at her, waiting for an explanation, for denial, for something that would make this make sense. Those are wrong. His mother's voice was sharp, defensive. She falsified them. They're certified copies from public records, my lawyer said calmly, sliding them across the table. Then the records are wrong. But her voice was shaking now. She couldn't meet her son's eyes. Mom? His voice cracked on the word. She's trying to destroy this family. Can't you see that? She turned your father against me, and now she's... I pulled out my phone and pressed play. His father's voice filled the conference room, calm and tired and brutally honest. Your mother stopped taking her birth control without telling me. I found out months after we were married. She admitted it during a fight. Said it didn't matter because we were already married anyway. The recording continued for 2 minutes. His mother's face went from red to pale. Her hands clenched on the table. He's lying, she said when the recording ended, but even she didn't sound convinced. She turned him against me. After 30 years, Mom. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. Is it true? Did you trap Dad? She stood too, her face contorted with rage and desperation. I gave him a family, a son, a life. That's not trapping. Did you get pregnant on purpose without telling him? Silence. She opened her mouth, closed it, then launched into attacks against me instead of answering. My lawyer let her finish, then delivered the ultimatum. 7 days for a full public retraction of all accusations against me. Apologies to everyone who'd been present at that party. A statement acknowledging that the baby was his and that I'd never been unfaithful. Or we'd file suit for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and all of this would become public record, including the family secrets. His mother tried to make him choose. Right there in the office, demanded he tell me to leave, to stand by his family, to remember who'd raised him. He just sat there staring at the table. Didn't say a word. They left separately. He walked out first, his mother shouting after him about loyalty and betrayal. I stayed in the office for another hour, signing paperwork, preparing for the next phase. I felt hollowed out and strangely calm, like I'd been holding my breath for months and finally let it out. 2 weeks later, I went into labor. It was 3 a.m, and the contractions woke me up in waves that made thinking impossible. I called him because he was still technically the father, whatever our relationship status was, and he met me at the hospital within 30 minutes. He stayed through the whole thing, 14 hours of labor, and he was there, mostly quiet, occasionally holding my hand when I reached for him, ignoring the constant calls from his mother that lit up his phone screen. Our daughter was born at 5:17 in the evening. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Perfect in every measurable way. There was a moment right after they placed her on my chest, where the 3 of us existed in this bubble that felt separate from everything else. Just us and this tiny new person we'd made. Her eyes barely open, her fingers curling reflexively around mine when I touched her palm. The weight of her, warm and real against my skin, made everything else feel distant and abstract for just a few minutes. It didn't fix anything between us, didn't erase the betrayal or the public humiliation or the months of paranoid accusations, but it was something. A pause. A moment where we could both just be parents instead of adversaries, where we could marvel at what we'd created together even as everything else between us was broken beyond repair. His mother showed up 2 hours later, breaking that fragile peace. No one had called her, but somehow she knew. Maybe he'd texted her despite my asking him not to, or maybe the hospital system had automatically notified the contact information he'd provided. Hospital staff tried to stop her at the nurses' station, but she pushed past them with the kind of determination that comes from believing you have every right to be somewhere, regardless of what anyone else wants. She came into my room without knocking, without asking permission, and tried to take the baby out of my arms before I'd even fully registered she was there. Just reached for her like she had the right. I pulled back, told her to leave, and she refused. Started lecturing me about how I'd poisoned her son against her, about how she deserved to meet her grandchild, about how this baby was family whether I liked it or not. I pressed the call button for the nurse and told them I wanted her removed from the room. She made a scene, loud enough that hospital security got involved. He had to choose. Right there in the hallway outside my recovery room, between defending his mother or having access to his daughter. He chose us, told his mother she needed to leave, that she could meet the baby when things calmed down, but not like this. She called him ungrateful, said he was throwing away his family for a woman who'd trapped him. Then she left, threatening consequences he'd regret. The next day, I got served with papers for a restraining order I'd filed preemptively. Not permanent, just temporary, but enough to keep her away from me and the baby without supervised visits. His mother sent him a text that same day saying she was removing him from her will, cutting him off financially, making sure he understood the price of betraying family. He showed me the message with a look on his face I couldn't quite read. Part grief, part relief, like he'd been waiting for this his whole life. The paternity test results came back when our daughter was 3 weeks old. 99.97% probability that he was the father. I'd never doubted it, but having the official document felt important. I didn't just send it to him, though. I called every single person who'd been at that party, organized a meeting, and made it clear that if they didn't show up, I'd be filing individual lawsuits against anyone who'd participated in the public humiliation. 20 people came. Not everyone from the party. Far from it. Some sent lawyers instead of showing up themselves. Others ignored the summons entirely, which my lawyer noted for the lawsuits we'd file later. But the ones who'd been most vocal, most cruel, they showed up because they understood the legal threat was real. His friends who'd made the poll and participated in weeks of speculation about my sex life were there, looking uncomfortable in ways that suggested they knew exactly why they'd been summoned. The relatives who'd applauded his announcement like he was some kind of hero sat in the middle rows, whispering to each other. The people who'd shared his sister's social media posts or added their own commentary calling me manipulative and dishonest were scattered throughout the room. I stood in front of them in that community center meeting room with my lawyer beside me in her professional suit and my daughter in a carrier strapped to my chest. This tiny, warm weight against my body reminding me exactly what I was fighting for. Set up a projector screen because I wanted everyone to see clearly, wanted no excuse that they couldn't read the fine print or didn't understand the science. Showed them the paternity test results on a projection screen large enough that even people in the back row could read every word. Every number, every certification stamp that proved beyond any doubt that this baby was his. Let them sit with that for a moment. Let them absorb what it meant about everything they'd said and done, every assumption they'd made, every cruel comment they'd contributed to. Then I gave them a choice, clear and simple and non-negotiable. Public apologies on the same social media platforms where they'd participated in slandering me, or I'd file suit against each of them individually. The defamation was documented with screenshots and recordings I'd been collecting methodically for months. The emotional distress was documented with medical records from my pregnancy showing elevated blood pressure that required medication, anxiety that interfered with my sleep, stress that my doctor had warned could harm the baby. The harassment was documented with police reports and witness statements and a paper trail that would make any lawyer salivate. I'd spent 3 months building an airtight case against every single person in that room, and my lawyer stood there with a stack of draft complaints ready to file if anyone refused, each one personalized with their specific actions and words. Some of them apologized immediately, red-faced and stammering, clearly understanding for the first time the magnitude of what they'd done. One of his friends from the group chat stood up and said he was sorry, that he'd gotten caught up in supporting his friend without thinking about the harm, that he'd been wrong. Another one admitted he'd participated in the poll and felt sick about it now. But others sat in silence, unwilling to admit fault but also unable to defend themselves. A few left without saying anything at all, and my lawyer noted their names for follow-up legal action. One woman tried to argue that they'd been manipulated too, that they'd believed what they were told, but went quiet when I asked why they hadn't demanded evidence before destroying someone's reputation. Not one of them could answer that, because there had never been any evidence. Just a paranoid man influenced by a manipulative mother, and a crowd of people willing to believe the worst without asking a single question, without demanding proof, without considering for even a moment that maybe they were participating in destroying an innocent person. His mother showed up halfway through. I hadn't thought she would, but there she was, standing in the back of the room. When it was her turn to respond, she refused to acknowledge the paternity results. Said labs could be bribed. Said I'd probably slept with someone who looked like her son. It was so absurd that people actually looked uncomfortable. Then I pulled out the final card. I projected the birth certificate and marriage certificate again, told everyone in the room the real story of his parents' marriage, how his mother had trapped his father with a pregnancy, then spent 3 decades projecting her guilt onto every woman in their son's life. His father stood up from where he'd been sitting quietly in the 3rd row, confirmed everything, announced in front of all these people that he was filing for divorce. After 32 years, he was done. His sister tried to defend their mother, but I had screenshots of every cruel post she'd made, every comment she'd left, every message she'd sent. Pulled them up one by one on the screen. She left before I finished. His mother followed her. His brother, who'd been so active in that group chat making jokes about me, didn't even show up. Sent a brief text apology through a mutual friend instead, too cowardly to face what he'd participated in. Most of the others stayed long enough to issue some form of apology, though I could tell many of them were doing it more to avoid legal consequences than out of genuine remorse. He stayed after everyone else left, stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking at the paternity test results still projected on the screen. He apologized. Really apologized. Not the half-hearted justifications he'd been offering for months. Said he'd been raised to see threats everywhere, and hadn't realized how deeply that had twisted his thinking. Said he understood if I never wanted to see him again except for custody exchanges. I told him I needed time. Didn't know if I could forgive him. Didn't know if I wanted to try. But our daughter deserved a father who was present and stable, and I was willing to work toward that if he was. We established a custody arrangement through our lawyers. Supervised visits at first, gradually building to overnight stays as he proved himself consistent. Therapy was non-negotiable, both for him individually and for us in parallel co-parenting sessions. 6 months later, things looked different. I got promoted at work, partly because I documented the harassment so thoroughly that HR took my professionalism seriously. Moved into my own apartment, 1 bedroom, that's small but mine. No shared rent, no shared lease, no ties to anyone I don't choose. My daughter is healthy and hitting all her milestones. He sees her 3 times a week, more as she gets older, and he's actually showing up, going to therapy, working on himself, trying to break patterns he didn't even know he had. His father finalized his divorce last month, moved into a condo near the beach, and called to thank me for giving him the push he needed to finally leave. Said he'd wasted 3 decades but wasn't going to waste whatever time he had left. He asks to see his granddaughter sometimes, and I let him. His mother sends letters occasionally, long, rambling things about forgiveness and family and how I've destroyed everything. I don't read them anymore, just file them away in case I ever need evidence of continued harassment. His sister blocked me on all social media, which is fine. I blocked her right back. Some relationships aren't worth saving. I'm not naive enough to think this is a happy ending. My daughter will grow up with divorced parents and a complicated family history. She'll have questions I'll have to answer carefully and honestly. But she'll also grow up watching her mother set boundaries and demand respect, watching her father work to be better than the patterns he inherited, watching her grandfather finally choose himself after decades of compromise. My daughter is sleeping in her crib as I write this, 1 tiny fist curled near her face. She has his nose and my stubborn chin, and no idea yet how complicated her family tree is. But she's loved. By me, by her father who's trying, by her grandfather who's learning what freedom feels like, by my parents who've been steady through all of this, and maybe that's enough.